Adoption Congress presents the 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991, in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape 2A.
Welcome. This is the workshop entitled Adoptees as Parents and Implications for Children of Adoptees. And my name is Linda Yellen. This is John Gagern and Kathy Brown. And we're going to tell you a little bit about ourselves and what we're going to be covering. I'm going to be the moderator of the panel, which will involve having the opportunity to start off some of the different areas that we're going to be talking about, as well as handling some of the questions, even though all of us will be able to participate in that. Tell you a little bit about myself, and then John and Kathy will share a little bit about themselves, what brought us to do this subject this afternoon, and the different areas that we're going to cover. I'm an adoptee. I was adopted as an infant, and I'm also a parent. I have a daughter who's going to be 14, who I just spoke to on the phone, and told her, reminded her which workshop I was going to do, and of course she said, well, why aren't I there? And I told her, you've been giving me enough ideas, maybe the next time around, because she's very interested in doing that. I've searched for both my birth mother and my birth father and have a reunion and contact with both of them and their families, and I found my birth mother over 9 years ago and my birth father 5 years ago. Professionally, I'm also involved in the field of adoption. I direct a program called Post-Adoption Resources that is sponsored from Lutheran Adoption Service, although it is a community-wide program offering services to triad members as well as professionals in the area of post-adoption services, everything from drop-in support groups for adult adoptees and birth parents, a therapy component, education, teen groups, children groups, and the whole range of services both through the phone as well as personal contact. And I know for me personally that I got in the area of post-adoption services because of my own adoption issues. And I was very interested not only at the time that I was searching and learning more about myself as an adult, as a parent, as a person, and as an adoptee, but at that point in time, there were virtually no post-adoption services going on. And the view that as parents adopt, just take the baby home, pretend that child was born to you, all the different issues that adoptive parents need help in, and for myself as an adoptee wishing that there were services that I would have had a chance to talk to other adopted kids growing up, that I wouldn't have felt as funny or as different because I would have had the same opportunity, the unbelievable feeling when I first walked into a search group and there were 50 adoptees and birth parents, and I did not feel different. I felt very much connected. So out of my own issues of adoption and my own self-discovery, that really was a very driving force in wanting to get involved in post-adoption services. So that's a little bit about my background, and I'm going to turn it over to John, and I guess we're going to be moving this little microphone along.
Thank you. I'm John Gagern. I'm an adoptee. I have searched and reunited with my birth mother about 5 years ago. I am a father. I have two daughters, one 20 and one 17 years old, and one grandson who is 9 months old. I am also a president of a search and support group in Detroit, Michigan. And what I hope I bring to this workshop is the perspective of the father as an adoptee, as a parent, which I think has some different aspects as far as women giving birth and having children. So I hope that I can add that perspective to this issue. Thank you. Now you broke it. Go.
Okay.
Well, it's just for the audio. It's not for the
I'm Kathy Brown, and I was born and adopted in Oregon. Since I was adopted quite a while ago, I grew up probably under different circumstances than most younger adoptees. I was not told I was adopted, but somehow or another I knew I was adopted. I have 2 sons, and I didn't start searching until I was in my 50s. I have searched and found my birth mother and met her in 1981, and I have met my birth father's family. In fact, I met both sides of the family within 24 hours. I don't recommend that.
Okay. We're really excited about this large turnout. When we planned this, we had no idea what kind of interest it was going to draw. And I know that we've been receiving feedback since the conference program came out, and people have approached us about the opportunity to talk about this. This is not an issue that is new to many people. It's just the opportunity for the first time to discuss this in this kind of a forum at a conference. So one of the things that we want to make clear is that we are not experts in what it is to be a parent, to be an adoptee, and to talk about the issues of children of adoptees, which for conveniences, I'm going to call them COAs. Now, for some people, we know that that's referred to in the community of children of alcoholics, but for our special aspect, we will refer to them as children of adoptees, COAs. So what we want to be able to do is talk about our personal experiences, talk about some of what we've learned from the contacts that we've had with adult adoptees and COAs, and to be able to share some of that, to hear from you as parents and for the other people who are here having questions, and to be able to have times during the presentation to dialogue and to react. So before I go any further, we'd like to get an idea of the combination of people that we have here today. So by a show of hands, how many of you are adult adoptees? How many of you that are adult adoptees have children? Okay. How many are birth parents? Okay. How many are adoptive parents? How many of you wear 2 hats? Okay. 3. How many of you are spouses of an adoptee? Okay. What categories did I leave out so far?
The unadopted adoptee.
The unadopted adoptee. Okay, how many of those? Okay.
Professionals.
And you've been adopted twice. Oh, professionals, isn't that interesting? I forgot, given the... See, I wear 2 hats, sometimes I forget. How many professionals? Okay. Working in the field of adoption? Okay. Anybody else that might have gotten left out?
Other family members who are adult adoptees with children at this time?
I'm sorry?
I have another family member who's an adult adoptee with children too, so I observe those relationships.
Okay. A member of a family that's touched by adoption. Okay.
Some of my best friends are adoptees.
Well, good, welcome.
Do they have children?
Well, we have a real combination here, and we're really excited to be able to do this. Let me give you a brief rundown of the areas that we're going to cover and how we're going to cover them. We've selected various issues that we want to address. For example, rejection, self-esteem, the aspect of the adoptee as the impending parent, either thinking about having children or during the phase of pregnancy, the phase of adoptee as new parent, and looking at some stages of development along the way. Also, we will address some of the similarities and differences between adoptees as parents who are in the search process, recent reunions, and post-reunion relationships, because we feel that there are some distinct differences for the adoptee as parent, just as for the adoptee themselves if they've already had a reunion or have not had a reunion. So we're going to be looking at some of those areas, and you'll hear sometimes the three of us commenting about those areas, sometimes it'll just be one of us commenting, and then at different times during the workshop we will open it up for questions, reactions, and again, as I had said, we're not coming across or wanting to pose as experts, but the fact that we've had the opportunity to do some dialoguing amongst ourselves. I know in the work that I'm doing professionally with adoptees, whether it be in the support groups, individual or group therapy, it's an issue that comes up. But I also have to say that a lot of what we're going to be talking about would be issues that would affect parents anyways, even if they were not adopted. So that's an important balance that I think we have to recognize, that not everything is an adoption issue. But we come to our experiences as an adoptee, but that's part of what we are. But I know many of my friends who are not adopted, they struggle with some of the same kinds of things, and their kids might trigger some of the same kinds of issues that get triggered with us, but are the reason that we have these issues sometimes come from a different place. So want to make that point clear. Okay. Oh, that's good, which brings me into exactly what I was going to be talking about, which is some general parenting kinds of issues. That as parents, we bring with us what we learned growing up, the messages that we received. And I believe, and at least the people that I have contact with, parents in general have very high expectations for their children. Most of the cases, unrealistic expectations, at least for a certain time frame. At times, we have the ability to let go of those unrealistic high expectation, which helps us to balance our lives and to achieve a little bit healthier parenting. And our belief is that healthy people make healthier parents. Also, I believe that we all have unfinished business that we bring into adulthood, and that certain areas, certain issues, leftover baggage, whatever people want to call it, can't get worked through until one is an adult. So virtually by that alone, we as adults, whether we're adopted or not, we bring some unfinished business into our adulthood, and then when we become parents, we of course have some issues that are triggered. So I don't want to come across like all issues have to be finished when one's growing up. I don't think that's possible. I know many adults can't appreciate what it's like, what their parents went through until they themselves are parents. And I think it's a sense of maturity as well. So in general, that's the groundwork that we want to lay for parenting issues. And when we look at some of the high expectations, control, unrealistic expectations, some of that is typical of parents in general. So on that, I'm going to talk about the adoptee as thinking about becoming pregnant and during the pregnancy. And then I'm going to give it to Kathy, and we have some very unique, different views and experiences. For myself, thinking about having a child brought up some beginning glimmers of medical concerns. I was my mid-20s. Oh, pretty soon people are going to be able to figure out how old I am, which I'm trying to hide most of the time. I don't have shame issues about adoption anymore, but I still have issues that I'm stuck about my age. We brought the coughing from Michigan. There were certain concerns that I had, but as someone in their mid-20s, at least for me at that point in time, I was very healthy and I was not as concerned as probably I would be now if I was contemplating pregnancy, just of awareness of that wasn't the big deal. But on an unconscious level, I also know that I was very scared. Not having medical history not having an understanding of what I was going to be able to bring to this child. And my husband, he had a heart condition, which was a hereditary heart condition, and I know that I had glimpses of fear as well as some jealousy as to he knew what potentially he could be bringing, and I did not. The other concern that I know that I had is just being afraid as a parent, being a new mother, what that was going to be like. I loved being pregnant. It was wonderful, even though I did not look terrific at all. It was just a joy for me, even when I had morning sickness. I loved it. And I also know for my adoptive mom, because at that point I did not have a reunion, it also triggered some issues for her, which is a whole other area about the grandparent issue. But then when I gave birth, it was a startling experience because my daughter, unbelievable blonde hair, blue eyes, but she looked like me. And it was just absolutely amazing. Where did she get that coloring from? Because my husband also was somewhat lighter than I am, but not to the point of seeing how that could happen. So naturally, because of the recessive gene, we knew that it had to come from both of us. But with my coloring, that was startling. And I look more like my adoptive family than my daughter looks like me in regards to coloring. But people who know me, and I live in the same city that I grew up in, they look at her and they say it's one face. And I know for me that it was just an unbelievable experience. And I know that even if I wasn't an adoptee, just giving birth is phenomenal. And I'm usually not at a loss for words, but that experience was just really wonderful. But having the opportunity to hold the only person that I knew who was biologically related to me, who was my flesh and blood, was unbelievably moving for me. I appreciated it at that point, but as I grew and I matured, I could look back and even realize how powerful that experience was for me. And at that point, at this point, I'm going to give the mini microphone to Kathy to talk about what that was like for her, and then we'll be able to pick up on all these things as we go on.
When I got pregnant the first time, it was as though I were an unwed mother and I didn't know what to do with it. I was married, it was unplanned, and I was in shock. I wasn't sure whether I could go through with it. I didn't know where all these feelings were coming from, but they were there. I had a difficult pregnancy. I had a difficult delivery. I had a very healthy, large son, almost 9 pounds. And I recall looking down at him when he was born and almost startled at what I said to myself. But I looked at him and I said, "Aw, poor little guy, I couldn't give you away." So that was perhaps my first awakening to the fact of mother bonding or nurturing or something like this. But I still, up until maybe he was almost 2 years old, I kept, something inside of me kept saying, you should not parent. It was almost as though I figured out the word was I was not entitled to parent. And actually bringing these feelings out and giving them words really didn't happen until after I did my search. And I was in my 50s by that time. So both of my children were long gone on their own. And all of a sudden, light bulbs began to go off in my head. And I wondered if there were any other women out there who had been adopted that had these same kind of feelings that I did. And so I began to ask, as they came into our group, how did you feel about being pregnant? Or how do you feel about getting pregnant? How do you feel about parenting? And of course, I guess the myth in adoption is that all adopted women want to go out and get pregnant as soon as possible so that they can have something that looks like them. And so I knew about that side. I just wondered how many more were like I was, the opposite extreme. And I was rather shocked to discover that although they may have put it in different words, they talked about fear. If my mother hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened to the baby. If my husband, wasn't a good father, this kind of thing. So I decided that I was not unique, that this was an issue, and that's why I'm so happy that this is being brought forth on a workshop today.
I think I'd like to talk just a little bit about the time that my wife and I were talking about having children. It was early on in our relationship and marriage, and as I think back on it, it was absolutely no problem to me. Child, who cares? That's easy. I was probably very blocked as far as having any feelings about thinking about children or what children meant or any adoption issues. I didn't really talk about adoption. I didn't think about adoption, and I knew I was adopted, but it wasn't a problem. Having children was easy, that you just have children and you raise them, and actually what happened is my wife had children and my wife raised them, and I stayed pretty detached. I didn't parent a whole lot in the early years of my children. She did all the work, and I didn't do anything, and I didn't get very close to my children. I stayed pretty removed. And part of what happened for me was that there was a time in our relationship when I became the primary caretaker of my children. And at that time, when I was responsible for their well-being and when I was responsible for their care, I started getting into feelings about, hey, wait a minute, something's going on here. Why is this happening? Why, am I all of a sudden having feelings about taking care of my children and being responsible for them? And for me, what came out of that was a lot of adoption issues, a lot of closeness and issues like that. And I think we'll probably continue that a little bit more, just to give you a little background of where us thinking about children was for me. I wasn't involved very much.
Pick up on what Kathy had said, that one of her reactions when she gave birth was, I'm not going to give you away. What happens, either consciously or unconsciously, for a parent who is an adoptee is a startling blow of that's what happened to them. And as I said, it could be conscious or unconscious. And we all know that we cope differently depending on what we're aware of and our coping mechanisms. So part of what comes up, what's triggered for the adoptee, can be a very conscious awareness, and they can do some healthy grieving around that because they did not receive that kind of continuing nurturing stability, no matter what kind of a wonderful adoptive family they might have had. There was still a break in that relationship. So if they're parenting their child and feel a closeness and a bonding and they're doing some really healthy things, there can be some conscious awareness of that grief. Many times, it is not a conscious, healthy awareness. It's an unconscious trigger, and what happens is it triggers for the parent, for the adoptee, a lot of grief. We know from the stages of grief that anger is one of the stages, withdrawal, sadness, helplessness, all those kinds of feelings come when someone is grieving. And many times in the work that I do, the adoptees that I talk to, both personally and professionally, they can look back and be in touch with the fact that that's what was going on for them. They were having some grief reactions. It was triggering their shame, their sense of self-worth. They might have been angry. They might have been so much in pain that they were distancing themselves from their children. For the same kind of reasons that non-adoptees struggle with the beginning years of parenting. Where it comes from, the triggers are different, but we all can think about parents that we know that had X amount of years of a difficult time. John talks about a denial process for himself. It was like, oh, okay, that's fine. So he was blocked. The pain, the sadness, the variety of adoption issues weren't coming up to the surface until he was confronted with caretaking for his daughters. And the adoptee as a new parent through the first couple of years, it's a very interesting process because that's when the bonding or the attachment disorders or attachment dysfunction can come. Part of what also comes up, of course, is the issue of am I worthy, as Kathy began to address. And that's a whole sense of the adoptee's sense of self-esteem, which new parents, their sense of self-esteem in most cases gets battered around anyways because it's a situation that is not predictable. Yet, depending on how someone copes, some people have the ability to let things roll off a little easier than others. And depending on if someone is really controlling and very rigid, being a new parent is going to really rattle the cage. So for adoptees as parents, and as we talked about the issues, none of us had had reunions at the time that we became parents. So when we address the issues of grief and loss, as we've already spoke about, that was in the contents of the adoptee who had not had a reunion. Let me go on the other side of that for just a moment and address the issues of adoptees who become new parents who have already had reunions. Some of the same things can happen. The issues of grief, the issues of anger, all of that can be triggered in the same way. The difference is that they've already had a reunion, which might be a positive experience, might still be ongoing, but the anger at how could this happen, that gets re-triggered. And depending on if they've had contact or still have contact with their birth mother, their birth father, the family of birth, that they can have that opportunity to rework some of that and to actually ask about it and to do some healing. At this point, how about some questions, reactions? Is any of this triggering things? Is this similar to what some people have experienced? We'd really like to hear what we're saying, if this fits for people or not.
I was just thinking, I have a 6-month-old daughter. And as I mentioned before, I haven't been reunited yet. I haven't found out who my birth parents are. But I remember when my daughter was born, and I did think, oh, I couldn't give you away. And I hadn't thought about adoption. Well, I thought about them, but when a counselor said, oh, there are always issues with adoption, I said, issues with adoption? What are you talking about? I have no problems with adoption. And when my daughter was born, of course, a lot of this all came out, like Pandora's box. And I thought to myself, I don't know how to be genetically connected to anybody. And it was just a bizarre feeling. I didn't know how I was supposed to, how it felt to be genetically connected with somebody. And that was really, I'm still not sure I know how that feels.
So a discovery aspect, because it's new, and just trying to get a sense of what that confusion and not being able to really grab it. It's not concrete. Thank you for sharing that.
That was a good term, genetically connected, because, let me go back. When you were saying about having the blonde daughter and so forth, I could relate to so much of what you were saying. And then I later had a son who was born with long black hair, so we're getting a little of everything. But But I remember having feeling really bonded to my first child at the beginning, in the first 2 years, and having a sadness that she was related to my in-laws, but not to my parents. But then when you said they're genetically connected, I think I felt that later. My daughter's a teenager now, and as she got older, and she doesn't look anything like me at all, maybe that Esther, I don't know. I had to sort of remind myself that I was related to her, because I grew up always being real aware in the back of my mind that I wasn't related to the mother that was raising me. So I emotionally had kept a distance, I think, which is too bad. And that term, knowing how to be genetically related, that's really interesting, because I think I've had troubles with that later on.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think learning how to be genetically related also can be connected to healthy relationships. Do we have the ability to establish and maintain healthy relationships, and how much is that connected to the ability to be genetically connected?
I wanted to make a comment about what my first pregnancy triggered off of me, which was massive control issues. And I think of myself as kind of control freak anyway, but nothing like that. And I developed a real identification with my birth mother. I had searched, but she found her dead, so I didn't have a reunion. Had a reunion with her family. But throughout the pregnancy, because I knew the circumstances of the relinquishment where she was forced into it, I became very irrationally concerned that somehow this baby would be taken from me in some way, whether it be taken off to the nursery for longer than I wanted. And so I got so involved with how this was going to happen, how the hospital setting was going to be controlled. I ended up wanting to have my baby at home and having to go to the hospital anyway, but I was terrified. I spent the pregnancy in agony over all these control issues.
I've heard that a lot from adoptees, the additional scare of a parent of losing that child, of safety concerns, not only from the time of pregnancy and newborn, but along the growth of the child, and the scares, the protectiveness. Thanks for sharing that.
Linda, I think Jane wants to say something. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any children. I'm an adoptee, and having children is like a train I missed. Or that's how it's always felt to me. And I think there's a lot of factors involved. I think that I carry some of my adopted father's infertility issues, some of his, unresolved stuff. And I was subtly discouraged by my parents from having children. They always told me I was going to be the career woman, and I guess that meant to the exclusion of having a family. And but the idea of having children has just always seemed like it's forbidden to me. That I was not meant to reproduce. I mean, I was rejected, so there can't be any more like me. And there's always been this fear in the back of my mind that, well, I mean, if I had a baby, I wouldn't know how to take care of it. And all my supporters would go away, and I would just have this baby and not have the first clue as to, how to take care of it. And so that's a painful area. And I'm afraid that I have so many issues around it that I'm going to run out of time here. I'm going to get too old to have children. I've got so much work to do, working it all out that, by the time I get all solved, I'll be children have kids anyway. So.
How does anyone in here feel about if they don't have their biological children, then instead to adopt?
People say that to me too. They go, "Oh, well, you can always adopt." It's like, oh my God, I've been on the receiving end of that already.
That question definitely stirred up some reactions.
I'm an adoptee as well as an adoptive parent. Adoption's always been really positive for me. It's a big part of my life, and it's always been pretty good. And I will say that when I found that adoption was the only option for having a child, it brought up a lot of things. I decided to search. I decided to do a lot of things that I hadn't really thought of before. And having an open adoption with my daughter, and having her birth mom have, I just think, what if I'm missing, But, adoption is always going to be here, and it's not always bad.
that's an interesting dynamic, the adoptee as parent of children who are not biologically related to them, either through adoption or through step-parenting, and what that means for them.
I'm an adoptee, and I was 35 when I had my daughter, and pregnancy did not come easy to me, and I thought I was facing perhaps adoption. And it didn't bother me at all. But when I had my daughter, I didn't want to let her out of my sight. She was 4 months old before I left her with a sitter. So it was quite good now.
Yeah, but don't you think that's when I first got my daughter, I wouldn't leave her with a sitter either. I mean, you know, don't you think that's every parent with a baby, you know?
I think there's really a wide range of responses. I think that that's not uncommon, but then there are parents who are able to leave their children and go out for an evening and have a good time and just let go. And then there are parents who go out for an evening constantly worrying about, are things okay? And there's differences of how we cope with that separation. And I know for many parents, you know, it takes them a while to get sitters and that type of thing, but where is that coming from? And for some people, it comes from the scares of losing. It comes from the feelings of that they're the only ones who can do that. You know, there's just so many different things that go into what makes us a parent, and as we had said before, some of it is adoption issues and some of it isn't, but it depends on how we cope with parenting.
I have, if you want to take her, and then I have a comment.
Okay, then we'll go on to the next section.
I wanted to know if your experiences during pregnancy brought you closer or put some distance between you and your adoptive mother or anyone. Was it something that was so uncomfortable for her, something she couldn't relate to or share, or was it something that she jumped right in and wanted to experience because she hadn't done it?
Okay. The question was, just for the purpose of repeating things into the tape, is how did my adoptive mom and how did I relate to her around the pregnancy and what did it bring up? It so happened that for my parents, after they adopted me, they were able to have 2 birth children. So my parents had that experience. We were able to talk about it, about her pregnancy and my pregnancy. I don't know what would have happened if she would have not had that experience. I don't know. You know, it's just impossible to know how someone would have been without that kind of significant experience in their life. But it allowed her to talk about it, and we were able then to be open about the fact that, you know, I was pregnant and she was. There were still some loss issues that I experienced. I mean, I knew that I was not born to her. And it triggered some things for me when we talked about her pregnancy that obviously I was not born to her, and wondered more about my birth mother and what kinds of things she went through in her pregnancy. Did she ever have other children? All those kinds of issues.
When my son was about 5 or 6 months old, we met a couple, and the girl had lost 3 babies. And so, of course, she was fascinated with babies. So the extreme of what you were talking about, hanging on to the baby, couldn't leave it, I offered to let her take my baby home for overnight, and so that she could hold her baby, do whatever she wanted with a live baby. And so in the morning when she brought him back, I said, well, how did he do? She said he cried all night and he wouldn't let me hold him, you know, in the way that she wanted to. So apparently my son was rejecting the idea, but I wanted to share with her my baby.
You should have done that a little bit earlier, on the age of 2, 3, 4 months, not on the age of after 6 months.
I shouldn't have done it at all, really.
No, the idea was very good, but in the beginning, after just a few weeks, you can easily do it. Then you are not really anything for the child, not so much.
Okay, we'll take one more question, then we'll go on, and then save them for the other parts.
I'm an adoptee and birth mother, and I think that being a birth mother, I was 20 years old. I started to understand
understand who my birth mother was. Until that time, I had thought that she was just somebody that didn't want me to be like me, had no use for a baby, and she was probably some cheap tramp. And then when I had a child, I realized that maybe that really wasn't what she was. And I started to think, well, I really love this child and I hate to give it away, but I have to do that. And so maybe she did that same for me. So it totally changed my way of thinking. It's what birth mothers really are and what adoptees are.
An understanding of the circumstances that sometimes pushes somebody into making an adoption plan.
What is it? It's like a devastating thing to do. Here you are an adoptee in a world where you don't know anybody. And all of a sudden, finally you have somebody you are genetically connected to, and you have to give that person away.
Are there other people here who are also birth parents and adoptees?
This is the end of side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B.
At one of the conventions, I think it was 8-9 years ago, a very dear friend of mine who lives in Chicago, that's how we met. We were sitting near each other at one of the sessions, and she's also an adoptee and a birth mother and never had any other children. So it definitely is another component of the adoptee as parent, even though they've not been able to physically parent that child.
I speak in front of school-age mother programs, and I find that the girls who are planning to relinquish their children are often adoptees, much more than random.
It's interesting.
It's almost as though it's natural.
Adoption. Right, exactly. But they were doing what you were thinking, kind of.
I think part of that, I know my sister is an adoptee and a birth mom, and a lot of that came from the encouragement of my parents. We got you because someone was wonderful enough to give away a child, and they were more than supportive of her doing the same thing so that someone else could benefit from her child. So, they were just a big part of that decision.
Okay, Penny.
Well, I just thought I'd throw in that I'm like sort of a mirror opposite of you in that the experience of probably not being going to have a biological child, like having a child for you, sent me into the search, and it was something I know I'm not saying putting that very well, but realizing I probably wouldn't have a biological child was what made me start thinking about searching. And I even used it as an excuse. I mean, I said, well, if I can't see someone who looks like me this way, maybe people would understand that I need to do it, and so now I have to go back to the other gender.
What triggers that search and how we can justify that, as many of us here justified it for medical reasons, but there was this little piece inside said, there's more than that. Or when we got that, then we took that next step. So the aspect of the adoptee potentially not having a biological connection through children needing to go back to do that. Really pleased at the energy that these issues are bringing up for people, and I know that there were some more hands in the audience, but we do want to move on to some of the other areas or we'll be stuck at that one section. The next area that we want to talk about is rejection and discipline and the preschool age child and what that surfaces for parents. And it's interesting sitting up here because you can see different people connect. Some people smile depending on which age we're talking about and different experiences. So for parents in general, going through the terrible twos, or as a professor of mine called it, the terrific twos, because the children are becoming more into themselves and separating, that's a very difficult time for parents in general because of the loss of control, the scares, the statement of independence. But what it does for some adoptees, from my experiences, is it triggers some issues sometimes that causes a great deal of stress, because depending on the adoptee's sense of self, it can be interpreted either consciously or unconsciously as a rejection. And many adoptees are very sensitive around the issues of rejection. So if that child, their own biological child, is, at least the adoptee is interpreting it as they're rejecting them as parent, that triggers a lot of difficulties, as well as the fact that during that that two-year-old phase, three-year-old phase, that the child is separating, not only rejecting the parents by going through the no, and running the other way, that they are separating by becoming more aware of other people in their system, maybe going to nursery school, that type of thing. And for parents in general, for many parents, that time of the child's life is difficult. For many of us, we didn't have the chance to go to nursery school and preschool, so it was when our parents walked us into kindergarten or put us on the kindergarten bus that was their point of separation. But for many times in society right now, children have the opportunity, obviously, to experience that. And what it is for parents, especially for many adoptees, that it's getting triggered consciously or unconsciously, is that separation. Here it is, in many cases, the only biological relative, and they're letting them out into the world. The fearful world. Are they going to get hurt? Is somebody else going to be more connected to them? And it can trigger some of those different feelings. I'm going to let John talk about that age, or that might still be the age he was in denial. So we'll bypass that.
I was in denial forever, but part of what I noticed as a parent is that I would see my wife have absolutely no trouble in disciplining my children. They would ask her for something and she would say no without any hesitation. I had a much more difficult time with telling my children no. It was just, I think I was very worried about the rejection and them not liking me or something, but it was, and I really didn't know it. I just thought it was something wrong with me, and my kids really picked up on it, because if they wanted something, they would come to me, and they knew they would have no trouble with me saying, sure, go ahead, even though I didn't really think it was a very appropriate thing to do. So, I really didn't have any understanding that why I couldn't do that or what that was all about. I just really wished that I could have been more like her and be able to tell the kids no and feel good about it. I never felt that good about just saying no to them.
Well, going back to the entitlement that I told you about in the beginning, I had this feeling that my sons belonged to my husband because he had the family and the relatives, and that I was, I don't know how to describe it, but some kind of permanent nanny, I guess, or caretaker. And so if anyone said anything above my decision to do anything with my children, I would immediately just give in to them and say, well, you must be right. And I think that because I was alone with my children for a great length of time, I couldn't always do that. So somewhere along the line, I had to make my own decisions. I had to, and it wasn't very hard for me to become responsible and have a sense of duty. I was brought up in the Catholic Church, and I think that a sense of duty is sort of always there with you. But I look back on it now, and it was as though I was the non-relative in that house.
I think these are useful examples and experiences, because where somebody can be overly connected, we can also see the other end of the continuum where there's that distancing, that separation, and the difficulty in attaching and really having that sense of a healthy parent-child connection. We're going to move on to the issues of talking to children about adoption and what that brings up for the COAs, what it brings up for ourselves as adoptees. Before we start on that, I want to comment that these kinds of experiences have such a wide ramification for all other areas in one system, as John's talking about some of the issues that went on with his wife, and that these, because there's other people in the system, we also have to recognize that it's not just adoption issues per se. How strong is the spouse in the marriage, how strong is the spouse involved in parenting, some of the other issues, the adoptee is parent who gets divorced, which hopefully we can talk a little bit about that as well. I know that when we looked at this workshop, 2 hours in some ways felt like a lot, but really we could talk about this for a long time because there really are so many different components and complexities to the issues. Looking at talking to kids about adoption, much of that is similar to what adoptive parents struggle with. Some don't talk about it, and some have a very open, ongoing, lifelong discussion about adoption. Depending on the person, depending on their circumstances, is how adoption gets spoke about. For example, in my situation, I had already had a reunion with my birth mother when I began to talk about adoption with my daughter, who at that point I think was 4 or 5, about 4. And I did it in stages. Talked about being an adoptee. We had a very good friend who had adopted a youngster. I did not begin by telling her that I all in one fell swoop that I was adopted and that I found my birth mother, etc., etc. But began to talk about what adoption meant and what that meant for me. And at age 5 or 6, she was very verbal and asked a variety of different questions. So I really took it based on what she was experiencing, what her needs were. So as she learned that obviously we were biologically connected and we looked alike and people would stop us on the street and make comments, it also meant that she was not biologically related to my parents. So that's another component, the issues of grandparents and how much gets talked about with the grandparents and how they feel about talking to their grandchild about adoption, because in many cases that stimulates the same kind of concerns that parents had when they started to talk about us. Talk about that we were adopted, that we are going to feel that they're not really our parents. And that's part of what my daughter had spoke about. I remember it as clear as if it was yesterday, riding in the car with my parents and my daughter, who's very verbal, saying, you know, Grandma, you're my grandma, but you're not really my grandma. Well, I was very pleased with my mother that she, you know, maintained her cool. And I made some, you know, comment, and my mother validated that, saying, which I've been saying to my daughter, that, yeah, she's not your birth grandma, but she's your grandma because she does grandma things, and this is the grandma that is, you know, is part of the family. So those are the same kinds of things that I know we have to recognize, and some kids will verbalize it just as we adoptees. Some of us use those words, and some of us clammed up and never expressed that or even was conscious of that as a thought. Then as time went on, I was able to slowly but surely implant the seed of at least my interest in the fact that I was finding out more things about my birth family. And my daughter began to ask me about my birth mother and her family, expressed some interest. I showed her pictures. She said she wanted to write to my birth mother, which was fine. They lived a couple of hours away. So they started to write. And at one point then my daughter said, I don't want to be a pen pal anymore. Can I meet her? So we went ahead and met, and then there's been an ongoing relationship, which we'll talk about during some of the post-reunion phase. But part of what was brought up in the discussions about talking about adoption to my daughter reflects some of the same experiences that I have as a clinician with the other adult adoptees that I deal with. It triggers various adoption issues such as shame, rejection, and loss. Because depending on what a youngster says to their parent, to the adoptee, some of it might be said, how could they give you away? How could somebody give a baby away? Which, let's face it, if that's verbally said to you, that is a very powerful statement. And I know for my daughter, she was able, as in many other different areas that she's so verbal, she can express that, which was very useful because I can then be able to respond to her and to explain to the best of my knowledge what went on. And I also believe that it's very difficult for kids, not only for ourselves as adoptees to understand how that could happen, but for the COAs. It just doesn't hit. Just like adoption doesn't hit until, as you experienced for you as a birth mother, and for many of us really into our teen years and adulthood, and then many times we have to meet our birth parents to really understand what really happened back then. But talking about adoption with kids triggers some of those same issues. It brings up loss, it brings up shame, it brings up, again, trying to figure out how this happened to us, and depending on if a reunion had already taken place or not, some of it on a very unconscious level is the same things that we heard our parents tell us, which can really be a very strange kind of a way when we start talking about it, because here we are 25, 35, 45, and we're using some of the same words that our parents used, or at least a different configuration of trying to make sense, and it's very much a triggering issue for adoptees. Again, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously, but it can really shake somebody up.
Or it cannot.
Right. See, that we have a real diversity.
I talk to my children like my parents talked to my brothers and sisters about adoption. We were adopted. You know, that's it. And that didn't mean a whole lot. And I think I just didn't have the knowledge of what adoption was myself to be able to relate that to my children. I really didn't understand what it was all about. And the process was looking, for me, what really triggered it was having to take care of my children, and then looking at what my relationship was with my parents and how I was feeling very connected to my parents, and looking at how I could unconnect myself from my parents and start a search. And at that time was when I was able to talk to my children about what my relationship was with my parents and what some of my needs were as far as searching and what I wanted to do. And I think that's when my children started, and along with me, started to understand adoption. It wasn't until I could understand it and feel okay enough for myself to look at some of the feelings and some of the things that I needed to do, could I in any way start my children off in looking at that. So we kind of did it together. It was a process that just happened. Yeah.
Do these two feeling differences have anything to do with male-female?
I think it might.
Giving birth and not giving birth?
Yeah, I think it might. I think that the men sometimes have a lot easier. I could stay in the background a lot more. I didn't really have to get involved and have the process of giving birth. I mean, that wasn't that big of a deal for me. I don't know, you know.
I think a lot of it depends on where the adoptee is within their own adoption issues. And as John said, that he started to talk with his kids really about what adoption meant as he became interested in a search and started to search. And that was really some of what was going on with me at that time. The difference is that my daughter was X amount of years younger at that time. So I could hear her talk about it in young elementary school terms, different than John's kids who were already teenagers at that time. So it was a difference. I definitely believe that there are some differences between the male adoptee and the female adoptee, and typically the spouse of the male adoptee becomes more involved than the male spouse, if I'm making any sense on that part. But most of it for me, with the issues of adoptees as parents and how they relate to the kids, seems to go hand in hand with how they're relating to their own adoption issues. And are they open about adoption and some of their own parenting?
Question.
Yeah, I have two questions. At what age do you think it's best to tell a kid, I'm an adoptee? And the other is, why do you feel you need to disconnect from your parents to search?
Because Personally, I
repeat
just...
the question. The question was, when is a good age to talk to children about adoption? And the second was, why did John need to disconnect with his parents around search issues?
As far as a good age, my parents told me from day one, I always understood I was adopted. My kids were pretty much the same way. It was just a very natural, yes, you're adopted. Why I felt I needed to detach from my parents is I really believed that I thought my parents were my parents. I didn't have an understanding that they were not my biological parents. So I really had to make a break from them, and it wasn't an extreme break, but it was just a separation of really clearly putting who these people were, at least in my perspective.
What form did that take, the separation?
Well, it's kind of funny. My father was a Lutheran minister, and the form took me not going to church anymore. and it sounds like it's not attached, but it really was. It was a statement that I was making that I was going to do something on my own. That was the first step, and that was like the thing I was able to say to them is, look, I am an independent person, and I'm going to do some of these things that I need to do for myself.
But you still had contact.
Oh yeah, I still had contact with them, and we resolved all of those things. It was a real neat process.
Mm-hmm.
Did that help, or? Okay.
I'm an adoptee and I have a son who's 6, and I remember it being very awkward to me when he was like 2 and 3, trying to explain why his grandmother and grandfather and my birth mother and my adopted father didn't live together, didn't know each other. He seemed to just want the facts, and when I told him that it was okay with him, it was very awesome to me. And then 2 weeks ago, I thought that kind of went away, but 2 weeks ago we had grandparents day at school, and I tried to talk him into inviting his aunt, and he wanted my mother. And I thought, 6-year-olds are so informative, they tell everybody everything. And I could just see him showing up, trying to explain things I didn't want him to explain. And realizing that somehow that awkwardness was still existing.
That sense of confusion and the loyalty and the conflicts that the COAs deal with in post-reunion relationships is really an extraordinary aspect of the whole opportunity to maintain not only the adoptee sense of self, but what kind of post-reunion relationship they have. And I'm glad that you brought that up. What I'd like is when we get to the point of post-reunion relationships and the confusion that it caused, please comment a little bit more about that, because I think that really adds a richness. We're going to move on to the issue of search and some of what feelings are brought up both for the adoptee and for the COA around that. Yes.
What about male adoptees as Mama's fathers? Have you had any, they're in the delivery room, they're aware, and they're at the moment of birth. Have you had any experience with that? Is that an experience for them like it is for us?
I can comment on my first daughter. The question was male adoptees being a part of the birth. For my first daughter, I was involved with her labor, and at that time they were not letting fathers into the delivery room, and I was asked to leave, and it tore me up. It really did. I was part of the process for a day and a half, and then I was asked to leave, and it just felt like somebody had ripped me apart and taken me away from what was going on. I don't know that was an adoption issue or just, a closeness type thing, but I really made sure that my second child, that I was totally involved in there for the delivery, and it was one of the most amazing things that I have ever witnessed, and I don't think that really had much to do with adoption, though. I don't know.
The words that you used about it tore you apart and ripped you away is what I hear from. Do you think it might have something to do with an adoption issue?
No.
Okay. John, goes back and forth in denial.
John needs help.
No, in another minute you'll say, oh yeah, I think that might have been. I think that's a good example. I'm not going to say that John was experiencing an adoption issue, but I can say that dealing with males in the delivery room or the aspect of, you know, their wife giving birth, many times it's on an unconscious level. And when they do experience that, I think that what's conscious for them is the aspect that that's a child who's biologically related to them, who just has seen the miracle of birth. But on an unconscious level, on a feeling level, the emotions, and it's so hard to separate, you know, the high of being a new parent and everything like that. But it does definitely, in my opinion, trigger adoption issues, because just the aspect of conception and birth, and the fact that for many of us as adoptees, we didn't hear about, obviously, our conception, let alone our birth and being born. We just heard about being adopted. And then when we can actually physically experience that, and the words that you're using, I know as a father how difficult that was, but I hear those words clinically from people when they do a lot of grief work about how they imagine they felt as a baby being taken away from their birth parent. And, you know, we'll hear John at another time let us know if he thinks that that's an adoption issue or not.
I can relate to that because when I was growing up, we had cats, and my parents always got the cats fixed so they wouldn't have babies. And I was furious about that because I wanted to live in a house where there was some kind of birth going, or some birth had taken place, and I didn't. And that was a real yank for me. And then later, I was in the Peace Corps, and somebody gave me a pregnant dog who had 8 puppies in my lap. So that's the closest I've ever been to a birth. And it was a magical thing for me. And it sort of told me that I was born through an actual anatomical process and all that.
It is. It's amazing when that connection hits. Which brings us to an area that I'm going to touch upon just for a moment before we go on to search, which is the issue of sexuality. And as adult adoptees, talking to our children. Much of it is the same struggle, again, depending on if someone's conscious or not conscious about it, as what our parents struggled with about teaching us, you know, quote, values and safe birth control, or at least abstinence before marriage, whatever it might have been from your own family of adoption and the values. But talking to one's child, the child of an adoptee, about, if at least, you know, we're assuming that, you know, messages for many people are to have children within marriage, etc., then you've already talked to your children about the fact that you are a product, in many cases, of a situation that was an unplanned pregnancy. So the issues, again, get triggered, not only for the adoptee in trying to figure out how do you explain that to your kids, because some kids will say, well, you're here, and, you know, the only reason you're here is because your parents didn't use birth control. What it also triggers for adoptees, again, consciously or unconsciously, is that little ghost, that little message as to what our parents told us growing up and in our teen years about being careful and what's good and what's bad. And when I talk about the difference between conscious or unconscious, many times we could have a conscious thought about that, but there's still stuff stirring. And sometimes we're aware of that rumbling, sometimes we're not. And that's part of what gets triggered as adoption issues, that we could be doing, you know, wonderful, healthy things with our kids. But as adults in general, that stirring gets going anyways at certain issues that get discussed. And if it's adoption-related issues, like talking about pregnancy, different life passages, that stuff is going to get stirred up again. We're going to go on to the issue of search. Let's see. Many times, and we're not going to go into a lot of the motivation of why people search, because people know that, but for adoptees, depending on if they have searched or not for their parents, and the obsession that lies with that, their children are affected. Now, how many adoptees here have already had had searched and reunited? Let's do that again. Okay. How many of you were somewhat obsessed during your process? Okay, probably everybody, or at least 99.9%, because the search in of itself becomes an obsessive aspect of one's life. That doesn't mean that it can't be put on hold, but depending on the person, even if we stop, sometimes it's still, you know, it's triggered. The stuff is surfacing and bubbling. So depending on that aspect for the adoptee, when they're searching, how does that affect our parenting? How does that affect our relationship with our spouse, our friends, our family, our work? When something as driving is going on in someone's life, naturally those relationships are going to take somewhat of a beating depending on how someone's coping with it. The other aspect of that is sometimes the adoptee during their search process can engage their family in a very healthy way, just as with other parts of our relationship. So depending on how the adoptee themselves feels about their search, what they're finding out, are they finding out things that feel okay to them? Are they finding out things that are very disruptive to them? Is that triggering a lot more sadness, a lot more grief, a lot more anger? That's going to affect their parenting. I'm going to let John talk a little bit more about his search and how he involved his kids and some of what they were feeling and experiences, and then same thing with Kathy.
I think when I decided to search, it was a family decision. It was a very open, talked about thing. Because of the process of dealing with my parents and my children's grandparents, and trying to involve them as much as I could in my process of search. One of the things that happened in my search is that it was an out-of-state search. So for a lot of the work I had to do, I had to go from Michigan to New York. So at the time, it was when I was responsible for the care of my children, I took them with me. So we got a lot of really nice trips together to New York, and it was because of my search. So they were, whether they really understood or cared whether the search was, we got some nice traveling time and some visiting some folks, and some time to talk about what I was doing and how they were reacting to it and how they were reacting to their grandparents and their alliance with their grandparents and what it meant for their relationship with their grandparents. They were very concerned that they were still going to be involved with their grandparents, that what I was doing was not going to affect their relationship. And it was a lot of work of reassuring them and my parents that this process was going to be a positive one.
Perhaps I have a rather unique reason why I began my search. I had a granddaughter that was born out of wedlock, and I made the decision, it was my son's daughter, I made the decision to acknowledge her. This sent a firestorm through the family, and but I never backed off. And within about a year after that, and as I said, I was in my 50s, I decided it was time for me to search. I didn't realize at the time that I was searching to see whether I could be acknowledged, but I'm sure that that was part of it. Since my sons were adults and living in different areas, I didn't have to share anything with them, and I find in our group that there are many adoptees who do not share while they're in their search, maybe with the people that they're living with, but extended family, their adopted parents, anyone else. And although my adopted parents were dead by the time I decided to do a search, I encourage everyone to please share their search with their adopted parents as soon as possible. I did, as I say, find, but it took me about 3 years, and Alberta will tell you that when I came to her group, she said, you're not ready to search, you don't want to find. And I suppose I was the most reluctant, long-time searcher that there was. I think it was about a year after I found that I finally began to, I decided to call up my sons, and I had one aunt left. And actually, I didn't tell my sons. I told their wives. I have never to this day sat down with either one of my sons and been able to talk about my reunion. One of the sons has actually met some of my relatives because they did, he did come up to Eugene, and it just worked out that way. And when we left, I remember him turning to me and saying, "Mom, who are these people now?" And I said, "Well, that was my two aunts." And he said, "They were really nice." Like, birth families maybe aren't nice. Anyhow, that's about where it stands now. I still have never had a real in-depth conversation with either one of my sons. I suppose I will remain for the rest of my life, although I hope not, in some kind of denial. Anyway, do you want to comment on that, Linda, as to why I am still in denial at sitting down and talking to my sons about my feelings on adoption and reunion?
Do you want me to?
Sure, you're the moderator.
Oh, well,
somebody asked the question back there.
Let me add that I know one of the things that you had shared with John and I, that fits for just generally how things get talked about or does not get talked about with your sons. The messages that I know that you had said growing up, that some of those sensitive issues in general didn't get spoke about, so it was not just adoption per se. I know that's what you were sharing with us, that's just some of how things were not communicated.
Probably. But that's how I was raised.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Can I just say that with that kind of, I'm having a hard time with my kids to tell my history. And I always associate, because I'm vulnerable and very, very sensitive to being hurt. And
you don't want anyone to laugh at you, do you?
Right.
That's my feeling.
Part of that anyway. But I mean, I'm open to vulnerability around sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And kids can be cruel, depending, I'm just saying that generally, when I feel oversensitized with the issues of adoption. So that, I only give a little chunk there.
The aspect of that there could be pain, that if you shared that with them and they misused that information, which definitely triggers some of the issues right now, but then goes back into earlier pain that still needs to be healed around how people feel about adoption and what kinds of things that's triggered.
I was just going to comment that we have 3 biological children, and one of the things that we've talked about is that our own children, especially our oldest daughter, has a tremendous fear about being rejected and not being wanted and hanging on to her own child. She has a daughter of her own right now. And I know, John Bradshaw talks about children taking on the unconscious aspects of the parents, and we've often wondered if they've taken on their father's deep pain around rejection. So that seems to be up for her. That's where she's adopted.
Interesting.
Kathy, I think you have an answer to why you haven't talked to your son. Sitting here, it's going through my head. You said that your son's reaction to your aunts was, oh, they're okay, they're nice people. And I think maybe you're almost afraid that if your sons were to really, both of your sons were to really meet your birth family, they would reject your family. I don't know, it's just, see, right now,
Well,
we're not dealing with that on a conscious level. It's difficult to,
I don't think that they would reject them if the opportunity arose that they met them. But to me, it would be like, so what?
okay,
it's.
You can't handle that. I mean, it's difficult to handle someone else, and I know, because I'm an adoptee as well, and I'm in, Kathy's age category, it's difficult to have somebody be so flip about something that's so deep within us.
This is the end of tape A. Please continue on to tape B.